I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, the world responds to Putin's latest outrage that has seen a nuclear-capable ballistic missile fired by Russia hit Ukraine just 50 kilometres from NATO's border, with one leading European politician saying the pressure on Putin must now be turned up to the maximum and made unbearable. We hear from the man who recently interviewed Oleksandr Kamyshin, a key aide to President Zelensky, and get France's final thoughts from Hungary. Later, we interview the commander of Operation Interflex, the British-led military effort to train Ukrainian recruits.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody is going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 9th of January, 3 years and 321 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by foreign correspondent Shanagher, the Telegraph's executive editor for audio Francis Dearnley, and freelance journalist Tom Mutch. I started with the latest news of the ballistic missile strike in Lviv. Now, Lviv was hit multiple times last night after Russia fired one of its new nuclear-capable Operation intermediate-range ballistic missiles. The weapon did not have a nuclear warhead on it in last night's strike. Ukraine's Air Force issued a missile alert in all of Ukraine from around 23:30 hours local time last night due to the threat of a Russian ballistic missile launch from Kapustin Yar, that's in Russia's Astrakhan region, that's over in the east right next to Volgograd, formerly the city of Stalingrad, about 400 kilometres east of Ukraine. It's where Russia reportedly stores the Operation missiles and was thought to be the launch site of that first Russian Operation launch against Ukraine in November last year when Dnipro was targeted. Russia's defence ministry somewhat obviously said the attack was retaliation for what they claimed was an attempted Ukrainian drone strike on one of Putin's residences, a claim Kyiv has denied and Donald Trump said didn't happen. But note the framing there, retaliation, as if Russia is forced to fire ballistic missiles at civilians. Now, multiple strikes in Lviv in quick succession were reported, which would be consistent with Oreshnik's multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicle payload, the MERV, feature of these types of missiles, allowing multiple warheads to be carried, not just one great big bomb, basically. Russian mill bloggers said an Oreshnik struck the gas field and storage facility near Stry, that's 50 km south of Lviv, about the same distance away from the Polish border. And Lviv city mayor Andrei Sadovyi said that there was a series of powerful explosions in the city. Lviv Oblast military administration head Maxim Kostitsky said a critical infrastructure facility had been hit in the region. Ukraine's SBU, the security agency of Ukraine, has since, in the last couple of hours, released photographs of debris from the area that it says is from the Operation missile. Now, responding to the strike, Ukraine's Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha said Ukraine would initiate an emergency meeting today of the United Nations Security Council, as well as a session of the Ukraine NATO Council. Additional consultations are also planned within the European Union, the Council of Europe and the OSCE, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. In a Twitter post, Mr. Sybiha said, "Such a strike close to EU and NATO border is a grave threat to the security on the European continent and a test for the transatlantic community." Now, Kaja Kallas, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, said Russia's reported use of an Operation missile is a clear escalation against Ukraine and meant as a warning to Europe and to the US. EU countries must dig deeper into their air defence stocks and deliver now, she said. Ukraine's Air Force said Russia had launched one medium-range ballistic missile, without naming it as an Operation, as well as 13 ballistic missiles and 22 cruise missiles, along with 242 drones. President Zelensky said in Kyiv and the region, the aftermath of the massive Russian strike is still being dealt with. All necessary services are deployed. 20 residential buildings alone were damaged. Recovery operations after the strikes also continue in the Lviv region and other regions of our country. Now, a contact of mine that I spoke to this morning in Kyiv said that last night saw a constant barrage of about 4 hours in waves of drones and missiles every 30 minutes or so. Somewhat concerningly, he said that there had been some air defence outgoing, but not as much as he had witnessed in other recent attacks. Now, in Kyiv, President Zelensky said that the embassy in Qatar was hit, adding that one strike in Kyiv hit residential buildings just after another blast, quote, precisely at the moment when first responders were providing assistance after the first strike. The attacks across the country, he said, took place exactly when there was a significant cold spell aimed precisely against the normal life of ordinary people. It's currently -8 in Kyiv. Now, amazingly, only 4 people were reported killed and 22 injured in the capital city. 35-year-old Ivan Fedorovsky told the Kyiv Independent, "Last night a drone hit us. It was a direct strike on our floor. A person died near my building. Someone who came to help me. It happened when a drone hit emergency workers. Europe has all the resources, money and weapons to help us end the war, but Europe lacks the political will." Mr. Fedorovsky's sister was killed in a Russian attack in Kharkiv in 2023. Now, Mayor Vitaly Klitschko said that 1 paramedic has been killed and 4 injured. He said several residential neighbourhoods in the capital were struck, mostly east of the river, in the Dniprovsky, Desnyansky and Donetsky districts, but damage was also reported in the central Pechesk and Shevchenkivsky districts. It led to another night underground in the metro stations for many people in the capital in freezing temperatures, as I've just said. In the eastern suburb of Brovary, a mother, father, grandmother and 5-year-old child were dug out from under the rubble of their home. They survived. Margus Sakna, who's the Estonian foreign minister, said this morning, recent steps by Ukraine, Europe and the United States to develop security guarantees, together with developments in Venezuela, have made Putin nervous. Russia's response has been air terror against Ukraine, killing civilians and leaving hundreds of thousands without heating, electricity or water in the middle of winter. Russia has also once again used an intermediate-range ballistic missile, Oreshnik, in a deliberately provocative strike close to the borders of the European Union and Nato. Mr. Sakna said, "One thing is clear. Russia is staying on its old path. It does not seek peace and has not abandoned its goal of destroying Ukraine. There is only one conclusion: to force a change in Russia's course. International political and economic pressure must be turned up to the maximum and made unbearable." Now, on the ground in the rest of Ukraine, little movement to the lines. Russia is still trying to push along the border areas of Sumy and Kharkiv Oblast in the northeast. Ukraine's Kursk group of forces yesterday denied that Russia had captured a village of Andrivka in Sumy Oblast. That's on the edge of the area that they've taken already. That village had been taken by Russia, recovered by Ukraine last August. Down south, there's still slight westward move in the vicinity of Huliapol, but also essentially the front line is static there as well. And the last one for me on the military updates. There's an article in United 24 Media today that says, lacking the same manpower resources as Russia, the Ukrainian army is increasingly fighting with unmanned systems. Against this backdrop, a slogan has emerged, they say, robots and drones go into battle first. They say Russian army losses in December 2025 underscore the effectiveness of this approach, with the trend of Russian personnel losses inflicted specifically by drones rising from 16,000 in July through 18,000 in September to 33,000 in December. Mikhailo Fedorov, who is currently the digital transformation minister, but he's been named by President Zelensky as the next defence minister, yet to be approved by Parliament, says that a total of nearly 110,000 targets were hit by Ukrainian drones in December alone, a 31% increase compared to November. It's interesting stats, interesting trend. I'll put the link in the episode notes today for you to have a look at. Okay, before we turn to our guest, Lily, what have you seen on the diplomatic front?
Yes, so I have a bit of a continuation from what I spoke about yesterday. Firstly, about the talks in Paris. Zelensky yesterday said that the Ukraine-US security agreement is, quote, essentially ready to be finalised. He just needs approval from Trump. He said on X, complex issues from the basic framework for ending the war were also addressed, and the Ukrainian side presented possible options for finalising this document. He said he understands that the American side will engage with Russia, and he expects feedback on whether the aggressor is genuinely willing to end the war. Now, this could have been complicated by last night's strikes, especially as Zelensky talks about Russia obviously being the aggressor, and its reluctance from Putin to show any public indications that he's ready to take note of the peace deal. It's also been revealed by Axios that on Wednesday, the US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner actually met in Paris. They're there, obviously, for the Coalition of the Willing, with Russian envoy Kirill Dmitriev to discuss the peace plan for Ukraine. Axios cited an unnamed source that said after Witkoff and Kushner spent 2 days in Paris negotiating with senior Ukrainian and European officials, they went off and spoke to the Russian side. It seems clear that with Putin, as I say, not showing any indication he's ready to sign any peace deal, they're still trying to get the Russians on board quite fervently. There is also a chance that Zelensky will travel to the US next week to meet Trump and finalise the security guarantees deal. So let's just wait and see what comes out of this. Another update on what I spoke about yesterday about the US-Ukraine minerals deal. The New York Times has reported that Ukraine yesterday awarded a bind to mine a major state-owned lithium deposit to investors that include one of Trump's billionaire friends. It still requires formal approval from Ukraine's cabinet of ministers, but sources said that it was essentially a done deal. The winning consortium includes Ronald S. Lauder, who's the cosmetics heir and has known Mr. Trump since college and apparently planted the idea in his head of buying Greenland. The other investor is TechMet, which is an energy firm partly owned by a US government investment agency that was created during Trump's first term in office. The sources told the New York Times that the winning consortium outpaced competitors and dismissed any idea of favoritism, but it's still, one could say, a pretty wise move to cultivate ties with investors connected to Trump at this moment. Moving over to France, there was a prisoner swap yesterday. Laurent Vinatier, who's a French researcher who'd served around one of his 3 years in prison after being sentenced for violating Moscow's foreign agent laws, was pardoned by Putin and swapped for Danil Kasatkin, who seems to be quite an interesting figure. He's a Russian basketball player who was arrested at a Paris airport last June and was wanted in the US for alleged involvement in a ransomware ring that hacked about 900 companies, charges he denies. Still a bit of a move away from the day job. And finally, I'm going to North Korea now for some news. It was Kim Jong-un's birthday yesterday, which we both missed, but he's written a letter of support to Putin. According to the Korean Central News Agency, which is the state news agency in North Korea, Kim told Putin he will continue to cooperate with Russia across various areas. In the letter, he reportedly referred to the spirit of the comprehensive strategic partnership between the DPRK and the Russian Federation, the strategic interests of the two countries, and the aspiration and will of the two peoples. He said rather lovingly, "I will absolutely respect and unconditionally support all the policies you pursue and the decisions you make, and I am ready to always stand together for you and for your Russia. This choice is unchanging and will reign eternal. I've come to feel once again the true comradely relations between us, and availing myself of this opportunity, I'd like to emphasize that I regard the friendly relations with you as the most precious ones and a source of pride." I think this is interesting because Kim and Putin's friendship is more than just a romance. As we have seen throughout the war, it has essentially become a military and financial and cultural alliance. We have reports from Ukrainian media that Russia is sending school children to a summer camp in North Korea, where children clean leader monuments every morning, listen to speeches about destroying American imperialism and blowing up the White House and computer games. And it's of course long been known that the countries have been swapping financial aid and military technology for soldiers to fight against Ukraine. Amid reports that the US and South Korea are keen to restart talks with North Korea, seems like Pyongyang is increasingly going to be moving to Russia to enable it to not need any reliance on the US or South Korea. It's already clear that this year will be an interesting one for North Korea, with the increasing public presence of his daughter and rumoured successor, Kim Joo-ae, and which side it will face with these negotiations between Trump and Seoul.
Thanks, Lily. OK, now, going over to our friend Tom Mutch. Tom, I think you're still in in Israel. You were when we chatted a couple of days ago, but you had a recent reporting trip through Ukraine. I'm keen to hear your views on that and any thoughts you had on the recent round of diplomatic efforts, Coalition of the Willing, these so-called peace talks, which aren't really peace talks, and the involvement here of Kirill Dmitriev on the sidelines of Paris. But Tom, what are your thoughts? And then after that, I'd like to ask you about your recent interview with Oleksandr Kamyshin. But let's start with your general thoughts from your recent reporting trip. Hello, Tom. Welcome back.
Well, Dom, thank you very, very much for having me again. So I think it's worth going over, firstly, now everyone is kind of looking back on 2025 to see what happened. And it turns out that of all of the years, this year probably didn't go as bad as a lot of people were thinking for Ukraine. A lot of people were saying, well, look, US aid is going to dramatically decrease, which more or less happened, although the NATO countries are still buying that a lot of aid and sending it to Ukraine. But one of the most important things that I think has happened is that, as we've been discussing more recently, drone production in Ukraine has just absolutely skyrocketed. I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but they produced something like 5 or 6 million drones in various capacities over the last year alone. Now, that's an absolutely extraordinary number for a country that produced 0 in 2022 when the full-scale invasion started. Also, Russia often seemed to have oversold, especially as it went further up the chain. It oversold the victories it was having on the ground. So, for instance, while it was able to take large chunks of Kupiansk, it took them with nowhere near enough soldiers that were able to actually hold the city. And Ukraine was able to stage not only a military victory, but also a great morale and propaganda coup from Zelensky when Ukrainian forces took the city back a couple of weeks ago. Also, it still seems that the Ukrainians amazingly hold positions in Pokrovsk and Myrnograd, which I remember I was in Pokrovsk going back almost a year and a half now, and people were saying, this is a terrible situation. The city could fall in 2 or 3 weeks. And now we're a year and a half later, and the Russians are still banging their head against the wall of Pokrovsk and are unable to complete the capture of the city, which is absolutely extraordinary when you think about it. Pokrovsk has now well overtaken Bakhmut as the biggest battle of the war. Now, the only region that I think is really concerning for Ukraine is Zaporizhia. It appears that there's still fighting going on for Huliapole. The real worry for that is that Ukraine seems to have been taken almost completely off guard. The city, Huliapole, which was an important defensive node, it doesn't look like there were great defenses built around it. It looks like the city was only being held by a couple of territorial defense brigades, not really enough to stand against Russia if they wanted to put all their might there. And the worry is that now they are approaching the city of Zaporizhia from 2 directions. Now, Zaporizhia is an absolutely massive city. About 800,000 people live there. And while the Russians have not shown that they have the ability to capture cities that large, what they have been able to do is effectively make those cities hell for the residents who live in them. I was just speaking to one of my contacts in Zaporizhia a couple of days ago, and she said they are starting to see the same sort of drone safari things as we all have heard about from some fantastic reporting in Kherson. That is starting to happen in Zaporizhia now. A couple of cars were set on fire by FPV drone strikes last week alone. And the closer the Russians get to Zaporizhia, the more their artillery and drone formations come within range. So that is really, I think, the biggest problem that a lot of people are looking at in Ukraine at the moment. People expect the Donetsk battles to just grind on and on and on, and the attritional warfare that they are. The Russians haven't seemed to be able to make any serious progress in Sumy or Kharkiv regions, but they are really seriously threatening in Zaporizhia, and that's really the front to keep an eye on for now.
Now, Tom, Oleksandr Kamyshin, interesting character, former Minister for Strategic Industries, now one of President Zelensky's aides. You spoke to him recently. Talk to us a little bit about Oleksandr Kamyshin and where he fits into the whole ecosystem, why we need to make note of this individual.
So Kamyshin is an interesting character who actually first came to prominence when Zelensky first put a cabinet together, we're talking like 6 years ago now, he wanted to introduce a lot of forward-thinking young people into important positions in government and industry. The guy, Mikhailo Fedorov, that you mentioned earlier, was one of those. And Oleksandr Kamyshin actually came to prominence because he was installed as the head of Ukrzaliznytsia, which is the Ukrainian railways organization. Now, that is actually a much more powerful and much more important job than it sounds like, because when the war started, the Ukrainian railways became the absolute lifeblood of the country, and they actually managed to function more or less reliably and on time. They ferried hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of civilians to safety going west, and they were also important in bringing in ammunition and supplies going east, coming from Poland. So he was very, very important then, and he was then picked by Zelensky to become Minister for Strategic Industries. Now, effectively, what his job there was to basically do what I said before, which is to scale up the enormous amount of drone production. Now, late 2023 is a very important, actually, hinge moment in the war, because two things happen here. One is that the Ukrainian counteroffensive fails, and two is that the US Congress first starts to cut off aid, and the Ukrainian armed forces suddenly have a huge deficit of artillery ammunition. Now, what that means is that effectively Zelensky sat Kamyshin and a number of his other ministers down and said, we have to make Ukraine self-sufficient in its defense industries. We no longer are in a situation where Ukraine can rely on its allies for weapons, supplies, and ammunition into the foreseeable future. And so Kamyshin, along with Fedorov, was one of the key figures who designed this transformation of Ukraine from being a country that was largely dependent on foreign aid and foreign resources for its war effort into a country that now produces the overwhelming majority. He told me that about 90% of Ukrainian kills on the battlefield now come from weapons that are indigenous to Ukraine. FPV drones, bomber drones, even Ukraine's own artillery systems, the long-range drone capabilities that have been crucial in knocking out Russian energy infrastructure, they're almost entirely built and designed from within Ukraine. And not only that, they've even moved to a situation where now they have a special type of drone interceptor that's very, very good at taking out Shaheds. He said, look, the only major things that we need from our partners, one is money, because Ukraine actually is very, very efficient. Its systems cost much, much less to produce in country than, say, complicated artillery systems that come from the United States cost. So one of the things they want is a large cash infusion into Ukraine's homegrown industries to help develop those more. The most complicated air defense systems, those can't come from anywhere except American production lines. And they're also still very reliant on US intelligence systems for targeting of troops and for knowledge of Russian whereabouts. However, they do say that they are working on alternatives for those if those ever were to fail or not be available for them, but that they can't really discuss those yet. So yeah, a very interesting conversation with a figure who, while he might not be one of the most publicly well-known, prominent Ukrainian figures, has been one of the real powers behind the throne in terms of making things like infrastructure and defense capacity run behind the scenes.
Colonel Andy Boardman commands Operation Interflex, the British-led multinational effort to train Ukraine's fighting forces. It's seen over 62,000 Ukrainians pass through its ranks since June 2022. I asked him for an update on Operation Interflex and how the training has adapted in light of the battlefield experience of Ukraine. Here is our conversation. So, Colonel Andy Boardman, thank you so much for talking to us today. Can we just start with the basics? What is Operation Interflex? Can you talk to me about the size, the scope and the international support, please?
Yeah, of course. Operation Interflex was set up in the summer of 2022 as a short but intense program designed to train civilians to be soldiers for the Ukrainian military. So it started off as basic recruit training, a short course to cover really the essentials of being a soldier. So how to operate a weapon, how to operate in different environments, rural, urban, trenches, how to do first aid, and how really to prepare individuals to be soldiers for the Ukrainian military.
Now, what's the length of the basic training package? I think you have a number of different packages, but let's start with the basic training package. And I base that against, I think it ended up as 6 weeks in the Second World War, and albeit this is going back some time, when I trained new recruits at Army Training Regiment Winchester, that was an 11-week package just to take them to a very basic level of soldiering. So what is the length of the basic training you provide, and what level does that take them to?
Well, the basic training started off as 5 weeks, and it's gone up to 7 weeks, so shorter than we would do in the UK. And it was a very conscious decision on the balance between how long the Ukrainian military could afford to send people out of country to train for, and how long you need to spend taking someone who has no military experience or very little military experience up to warfighting standard. And this is even more so than when you'll have been in Winchester. The output standard is not just going to a British Army battalion to go and do exercises and training and routine regimental duty. It's going straight to war. So there's a very steep learning curve. It's more of a learning cliff, frankly, for these individuals to get themselves up to standard. And when we designed the program at the beginning, and I was there in the summer of 2022, commanding one of the battalions that was doing this training, there was a conversation about stripping it right back to the essentials. So where our training in the British Army would include a lot of broader activities about being in the military, everything from drill through to military history and leadership theory. For these recruits, it's about, can they operate a weapon? Can they shoot straight? Can they deal with mines and get themselves out of a minefield? Can they cope with a chemical warfare threat? Can they cope with a drone threat? Can they clear a building or operate as a formed section or platoon? So it was consciously a short course, but really packed full of content.
Thanks. If I could put some flesh on those bones, please, because a lot of our listeners will be either ex-military or very, very aware of military activity. So, again, back to the time, and it was a long time ago when I was training recruits, but at the end of those 11 weeks, we would take them up to being able to provide basic administration in the field, i.e. hide, eat, keep themselves clean, keep their weapon clean. They'd be able to shoot accurately at 400 meters, and they'd be able to operate as a pair, so a buddy-buddy system. Is that the kind of level you're talking about, or do you go a bit further than that? You just mentioned about operating at section and platoon level. That's a little bit beyond what we would have expected a basic phase one soldier to achieve. So could you put a little bit more flesh on the bones of what they can do after 7 weeks, please?
Yeah, of course. There is a fair amount of being able to operate in the field. We're conscious that most of the recruits that we'll have trained will have deployed into effectively a static defensive position, operating out of trenches and that sort of thing. We don't just teach how to live in a trench because we want them to be able to do more than that. We want them to be able to do offensive operations, able to operate in different sorts of environments. But there's a certain amount of how to live in the field, how to administrate yourself, as you say, the ability to eat and keep yourself alive, the ability to camouflage and to conduct defensive positions, obviously really important. In terms of the extent to which we get into collective training, we're very much doing individual training, but sometimes you need to operate in a slightly collective way in order for it to pull in some of the complexities of it.
When you say collective, you mean using other bits and pieces of the military?
No, I mean, sorry, as in operating as a platoon or as a company.
Right.
It's very much infantry only. We cover the most basic elements of talking about indirect fire support, for example, but we don't teach that. But they do operate as sections within a platoon construct. We also offer other courses here where we teach section commanders, platoon sergeants and platoon commanders. And for them, it's much more about operating as a small unit. But the recruits, they need to see a man or a woman left or right of them as they're moving through urban areas or rural areas to understand that. But we're conscious that when they get back to Ukraine, they'll do follow-on training, which integrates them into their company, their battalion.
And just on the basic training package again for a moment, what's the average age of the recruits you're seeing coming through?
I think the average age over the last year has been sort of mid to late 30s, that sort of bracket. You get a few younger, a few older, but generally speaking, they're in their mid to late 30s. That
seems to be broadly consistent over the last few years, I think. Is that accurate? And that's quite old, isn't it? Mid to late 30s.
It's quite old to start an infantry career. Yeah, that is true. When I was doing this in the summer of 2022, there were some younger men coming through. We've seen some older men come through. We've had men in their 50s, which again that's a challenge to take on an arduous military role when you're sort of a little bit more mature, shall we say. But I think the average is always sort of mid to late 30s.
And these are all volunteers because there's no mobilisation yet in Ukraine. So these have volunteered. Do they offer any views on this? I mean, do they realise that? We make light of it ish, but mid to late 30s, it is then starting to be physically arduous, on the old knees in those cold trenches. I mean, do they offer any opinions that they think it's a younger person's game?
We do get a lot of individuals who've been mobilised, who've been effectively given their letter to say they need to report to the military, to mobilisation sort of centres for training. And they are exceptionally sanguine about that. They're very patriotic individuals. They know that their country is at war. They know that the army is required to defend their country, their way of life. They clearly didn't join the army when they were younger men and women. However, now they see that their time has come round and they effectively understand what's required of them and they want to make the best of it. They're very motivated about the training because they know how life-saving it can be, and they are very keen to take as much as they can from their short time here in the UK. But they are patriotic individuals and they do want to do their best. They may not have chosen this path, but they understand that it's very important.
How much choice did they get when they reach above the age of 25? Now they have to present themselves to a mobilisation office, make themselves available for service, but that doesn't automatically mean they're going into the infantry. How much choice did they actually get about where they could go?
To be quite honest, I've got no idea. I don't know how that system works at all. We just receive the individuals, they come over here and they're given to us for training. I'm not cited at all on how the General Staff does it. They have an enormous challenge at the minute. Their mobilisation recruitment process is challenging for them, and they have a lot of work on their hands to maintain the size of their army as they're doing that. And we don't get involved with that at all. And I'm afraid I don't know how they choose who goes where.
Now, I saw an interview you did on BFBS, British Forces Broadcasting Service, recently. You said the way Ukrainians are fighting is changing over the years. We're making sure we're integrating that into our training. You highlighted first-person view drones and that kind of thing. So how difficult is that? You've got not only the job of introducing largely civilians with no military experience to basic soldiering, and now you're having to take on one of the most consequential new developments in modern warfare. I mean, how on earth are you able to find the time to do that, let alone think about what you should be teaching?
Yeah, it's challenging, but it's also really exciting because, like I say, we decided early on what was going to go in the course. But ever since that happened, I think it's been incumbent on us, and I've certainly felt it for the 18 months that I've been doing this job, to do everything we can to keep up with the developments on the battlefield. And this is a very fast-paced battlefield. The technological advances are measured in weeks rather than months, the way that things are changing. And then from the technology comes the tactics. So really important for us to make sure that what we're teaching is up to date. It would be completely useless if we started off a lesson with, when we were in Afghanistan, we used to do this. We need to be teaching the Ukrainians the tactics that they will use when they get back to the battlefield. We teach quite a lot of Ukrainian soldiers who've come from the battlefield. So all the leadership courses, the sergeants and the section commanders, they've come from the front line. Some of them have been there for some years. If they turned up to a lesson and we were there banging on about Northern Ireland or Afghanistan, then we'd completely lose the audience. And they just quite rightfully would not want to hear what we had to say. So we need to be current and up to date. We need to integrate the current tactics into the training. There's also a huge benefit there for us in the British Army and the other 9 partner force armies who are on part of this training, that we get to learn from these individuals. And it's a combination of our intelligence feeds from Ukraine and talking to the Ukrainian staff and junior leaders that we have with us, that we can learn from them how they're operating with drones, how they're countering chemical warfare, how they're operating in built-up areas, to make sure that our training is as up-to-date as it can be. And then obviously we learn from that as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. I mean, is there a credibility gap there at all by not physically being in Ukraine to learn these lessons? You're hearing it secondhand, albeit very accurately secondhand from those that have actually been there and done it. But then you're having to inculcate that into an existing training mechanism and deliver it back to them. Do you often get people just looking at you and saying, well, why do you have the right to be able to teach us on this stuff?
I don't think so, no. We do have instructors who are delivering training to people who are more operationally experienced than them. That's definitely true. There are young British Army corporals who have potentially not been in operations, training soldiers who have been in operations, who've been fighting a high-end conflict. However, we have an institutional credibility in the British Army and all the other partner force armies who are a part of this with us, that we have an inherent credibility that what we're teaching is of value. It is important that we keep ourselves up to date. That young British Army corporal can teach current tactics, even if he hasn't actually been to the east of Ukraine and fought, because he knows what's happening and he's able to teach that. He can also add to those tactics with a huge amount of British Army doctrine and knowledge that we can sometimes enhance what we're hearing from the Ukrainians of how they've been operating and add in some of our own understanding. And the combination of the two becomes much richer. So I have no concerns on that. The first few days, there's always a little bit of sounding each other out, as you have a lot of very combat experienced, battle-hardened Ukrainians looking at a group of European instructors. And there's obviously a little bit of skepticism over why we're here in the UK, what's going on, what's the point of this? But very quickly, they realise there's a lot to be gained from it. And by the end of the course, if you go to one of the departure parades and you see the amount of hugging and gratitude that goes on, there's no doubt at all that even the most combat experienced Ukrainians are getting significant value from this training.
Yeah, although I do notice when you pipe them out of camp on the last day, you do subject them to the bloody bagpipes, which you think, crikey, haven't they got enough trouble? Anyway, all men? Do you have any women coming through on basic training or on any of your training courses?
We do have some female trainees, yet not very many. We do have some.
And the hardy perennial, what is the view of women in close combat roles?
I think within the Ukrainian military, there's no problem at all about having female soldiers in the front lines. I don't believe they can be mobilised into the infantry, but if they volunteer, then there's absolutely no problem with it. And the female soldiers we've had on our courses have performed excellently.
Now, looking at some of those wider training packages, so you've got the 7-week basic training module. What else are you working on?
We've also been delivering some instructor training, which is a really important branch, really, from our initial recruit training. That it became clear quite early, a couple of years ago, that the Ukrainian training system itself would benefit from an injection of more instructors. So we set up an instructor course, which effectively runs alongside the recruit course and teaches Ukrainian non-commissioned officers how to be instructors. And they go through some theoretical instructor training and they get effectively mentored by UK instructors. And we've been using them to effectively teach some of the recruits. So they get instructor practice from it and the recruits get taught by Ukrainians with real combat experience. So lots of mutual benefit. And over the last 3 and a bit years, we've trained 11,000 Ukrainian instructors who've gone back into the system. Some of them go back into Ukrainian training centres. Some of them go back into the units and effectively to provide a kind of training wing function within the units to kind of do on-the-job training. We've also done a lot of tactical leadership training. So we run 3 courses, the section commanders, platoon sergeants and the platoon commanders courses. The section commanders and the sergeants are 5-week courses. The platoon commanders course are 10 weeks. And for them, it's all about everything from junior command and leadership through to tactics. And for the platoon commanders, it's effectively a condensed Sandhurst plus platoon commanders battle course in 10 weeks, which is a significant challenge for those individuals, but they get a lot from the course as well.
Now, language, I guess, must be an obvious barrier. How do you get around that? Doesn't that really slow down a lot of the training if you're having to do it through interpreters? And, well, answer that one first, please. And then I'd like to talk to you about the doctrine that you're teaching. Is this a sort of Western NATO doctrine, or are you, because a lot of the middle and senior levels of command in the Ukrainian military would, of course, have been trained on former Soviet doctrine. But start with the language one first, please.
Yeah, the language very obviously is a thing. We have linguists who work with us. We have a high point. We had about 400. We have fewer now as we've adjusted the way we're training. But we have a number of linguists here who are absolutely critical to our delivery of this training. They are mostly female, mostly been in the UK since the full-scale invasion, and they're enormously valuable to us. They largely consider this to be their contribution to the war effort, and they are super motivated. They spend long hours, day and night, in all kinds of weather, out on the training area, shouting at recruits to translate the instructions of the instructors, and then providing feedback back to the instructors of what the recruits are saying and questions they're asking. So they work extremely hard. They are very knowledgeable now in terms of the course. Quite a lot of them have been on the operation for 3 years. They know the language really well. They know the vocabulary, which obviously is quite specific at times, and they are able to smooth the transfer of information back and forward, so we really don't suffer with a slowing down of the process. In terms of the doctrine and so on, we're teaching for the recruits, this is basic individual soldier training, so it doesn't really get up to the level of doctrine. For the leaders, that's where we start to get probably into more tactics. And we are trying to strike a balance between teaching them how to hold the line, how to do sort of active defence, but equally trying to give them some more kind of NATO tactical understanding of things like how to conduct fire and manoeuvre, how to coordinate movement of disparate groupings, how to integrate other assets. And we do use a lot of UAS here. So we talk about surveillance, and we talk about kinetic capabilities of some of the drones that we use. So we have drones that can drop simulated munitions, and we have first-person view drones that can sort of attack. So the battle space management and the airspace deconfliction, the coordination of all that sort of stuff, which is hopefully that's giving them a capability which can enhance their battlefield experience.
And do you run any of these training packages alongside existing British Army training stuff? Do you ever sort of dovetail? Do you act as enemy for British Army exercise or vice versa at all? Is there any crossover?
There is some of that, yes. There are other initiatives within the British Army's support for Ukraine whereby Ukrainian students attend British Army courses. I think there's an officer cadet at Sandhurst at the moment. There's a lieutenant colonel on the Advanced Commander Staff course. Every now and again, they send some section commanders to South Wales to do the British Army's section commander battle course. So that does happen. We are also very keen to feed the sort of exposure to Ukrainians back into the British Army system. So we've recently supported a couple of British Army collective training events down on Salisbury Plain, whereby some of my instructors and particularly drone operators have gone down to support the enemy force for British Army exercises to try and bring some of the understanding of how particularly drones are being used in Ukraine, which the Ukrainians are at the front end of how drones are being used at the most tactical level. And we've been playing that back in to try and help the British Army develop the ability to counter that. So we're certainly looking to expose as much as we can of Ukrainian understanding and expertise back into the British Army.
And on the wider support, you mentioned, was it 9 other countries, Australia and,
correct,
and so on, supporting? Has that stayed stable? Any waning in support from the international partners?
We've been very, very lucky with the level of international support we've received. When I started this off, I was up in the northwest of England with my battalion, and within a couple of months of us starting, I received a platoon of Finns and a company of Danes came to join us, and that was fantastic for us, the opportunity not only to have additional people to help us train, but the international environment that created was hugely valuable for my riflemen to be able to operate with other soldiers from other allies in Europe. The number of partner force nations has grown over time. There have been a couple of changes over the last year that nations have retasked their forces elsewhere. You'll be aware there's a lot of other missions and operations where European nations particularly are supporting all across Europe. I think there are sort of more than 40 sites across Europe, I think, where training of Ukrainians takes place. There are nations from outside Europe, so we've had Canada, New Zealand and Australia here. It's actually Five Eyes nations who are supporting this as well, and they've been evolving their support over the course of the last couple of years.
Well, have you got all the resources you need? Any pressure? It was funded through to 2025. I've not seen any news of the budget being increased or continued through 26, 27.
We're effectively funded through to the end of this calendar year. The Secretary of State announced that Operation Interflex will continue until at least December 2026. I've had no problem with money available effectively. The budget we have is very generous. We use quite a lot of ammunition because we think it's important for the recruits to get plenty of shooting time. We have to obviously equip all the soldiers who come through. Every trainee who comes in gets given a kit bag with about 75 items in it, which costs about £4,000 per individual, which sets them up for training, but they also take it back with them. And then there are costs obviously associated with sort of housing and feeding and all that sort of thing. And the various bits of equipment that we need, the sort of, the drones and so on that we need to use for training. But I haven't had any problem with shortfalls in the budget. The broader question about the military defence budget, I'm not cited on that, I'm afraid. I'm fortunate enough not to be involved in MOD financial issues, so I would leave that to them to comment on.
Sure. And now, just finally, I very glibly said earlier on that you piped them out of camp, the bagpipes, etc. Of course, I love the bagpipes, having been in the Scots Dragoon Guards. But seriously, what's that last message? Who do they see at the end of their training before they get on the buses and leave and go back to fight in Ukraine? And what message do you leave them?
The departure parade is effectively a congratulations that they've completed the course. It's a sense of camaraderie, really, that is remarkable to see. There's a lot of gratitude coming back from the Ukrainians, the investment from the instructors, whether they be British Army soldiers or Romanians or Finns, or whoever they've had training them. The training team is effectively showered with hugs and handshakes from the Ukrainians, which is really nice to see the bond that they formed over the course of the training. And I think there's a tangible sense from the instructors of that's all we can do for you now. All the best. Good luck. You are well prepared for this. And we want to send off the trainees with a sense of confidence. We do interview all the trainees as they leave and ask them effectively if they've got any feedback for how we could improve the course. But we do ask them about their confidence and how they feel they feel ready to go back to war, either for the first time if they're recruits or go back if they're more combat experienced. And they do generally report a sort of a confidence level up in the sort of 90% bracket, which is fantastic. But that parade is all about saying, we're with you, we've trained you as best we can, best of luck, and on you go. And I think for the Ukrainians sitting on the buses as they leave, as you say, led by a piper or a regimental mascot, depending on who's been doing the training, they are hopefully feeling there's a sense of unity with the number of nations who are standing by the side of the road, saluting them as they leave. But for the instructors on the sides of the road, I think they're watching these recruits or these junior SEOs go back to war and feeling, well, we've done our bit now. Our role in this is a training role. We're supporting them and we've done the best we can, and off they go. And we wish them the very best of luck.
Colonel Andy Boardman, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
We'll go to final thoughts now. I've just been scrolling as we've been on air. President Zelensky has issued another statement in relation to last night's attack, in particular the Oreshnik missile attack on Lviv. He says a clear reaction from the world is needed. Russia must receive signals that it is its obligation to focus on diplomacy and must feel consequences every time it again focuses on killing and the destruction of infrastructure. That's just out from President Zelensky. So, final thoughts. My final thought is, you'll remember lots of commentary late last year saying that 2026 is going to see an increasingly stalled Putin, as in the front line's not going anywhere, increasingly stalled Russian forces, leading Putin to lash out in other ways: sabotage, espionage, assassination overseas, that kind of thing, escalation basically against the West. All he's showing he can do inside Ukraine is hit energy facilities in an attempt to terrorize the population into pressurizing the government to give in, while hoping Trump comes to his rescue. But that strategy, the Trump rescue strategy, has been undermined by Ukraine, seemingly probably since last February's meltdown in the White House, deciding to agree as far as possible with everything that comes out of the White House, implementing stuff here, delaying stuff there, signing mineral deals where they can on the edges, etc., but never being in a position of being able to be blamed for blocking US diplomatic efforts. I would suggest the lack of recent criticism, especially from the likes of J.D. Vance, suggests that strategy has been wise. So, in light of what happened last night, was the Oreshnik missile strike more about Lviv and critical infrastructure and heating systems, that kind of stuff, or was it more about landing something close to NATO's border as Putin's desperation mounts and his room for manoeuvre shrinks to focus minds over here? Will Europe recognise this and act alone, or still wait behind the US that has shown every reluctance to act decisively against Putin? We know Russia has rejected coalition of the willing, any idea of boots on the ground in Ukraine. It's now firing nuclear-capable missiles within 50 miles of NATO. So my question is, this weekend, what does Europe do now? Lily, where do you want to leave us for the weekend?
I also wanted to talk a bit about NATO. So the EU is obviously very rattled about Trump's comments on Greenland and possibly taking it over. We've seen a Reuters exclusive this morning say that US officials have discussed actually sending lump sum payments to Greenlanders ranging between $10,000 to $100,000 as part of a bid to convince them to secede from Denmark and potentially join the US. Meanwhile, Macron yesterday said in his annual speech to French ambassadors that the US under Trump is, quote, breaking free from international rules and gradually turning away from some of its allies. He also said that multilateral institutions are functioning less and less effectively, and we are living in a world of great powers with a real temptation to divide up the world.
Indeed. Tom, as our guest, what would you like to leave us with?
So I would actually like to leave you with a parallel that I was thinking about the situation, talking about in Venezuela, the Greenland parallel, Article 5 and all of these issues. Another place where I've been reporting recently is I've been in Lithuania, where I've spoken to a couple of Lithuanian officials. And one of the things is that countries in Europe now are planning for a future where Article 5 is no longer the central factor of their defense. They've kind of finally been woken up to, okay, we may not have the US on our side forever. This is far too late. There were warning bells flashing as far as the annexation of Crimea, then again when Trump was elected in 2017 with a very obvious skepticism of NATO. It should have been a kind of a four-alarm fire when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine kicked off in February 2022. I was also thinking about another parallel which is possible to make, I think, between Donald Trump and potentially President Putin, because a lot of people have said, okay, Venezuela is how you really do a special military operation. Well, I think it's also worth pointing out that Putin had a very successful equivalent of a special military operation back in 2015 when he took over Crimea almost bloodlessly with very few shots being fired. Now that, he then had a successful intervention, or at least what seemed like a successful intervention in Syria in the following years, and that effectively built up his hubris to where he thought that he could stage such a large-scale invasion of Ukraine as he did in 2022 with no consequences, simply because things had gone so well for him in the past. I can't help wondering, is there a chance that Donald Trump could fall into a similar mindset? He has such a successful operation in Venezuela that whets his appetite for using the US military as kind of a cure-all for any sort of international problems. You know, he's talked about having territorial designs and no one can ever really know how seriously to take them on places as far-flung as Panama and Greenland and even Canada. And once again, you can never know whether he's joking or not about something like this. I have, by the way, a new section on this in the upcoming edition of my book, The Dogs of Mariupol, which is going to be released in a couple of months from now, where I'm going through all of these kind of parallels and whether they could erupt in something really, really ugly by the end of Trump's second term in office. And so I think that's the final thought that I'll leave you on. Thank you again for having me.
Thanks, Tom. And for a final thought to end the week, a short historical reflection now from Francis, who's still in snowy Hungary, meeting with bigwigs there before he travels home.
Thanks, Dom. Last night, I had the pleasure of dining with a member of the Habsburg dynasty, the former ruling family of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Here in Budapest, it's impossible not to feel the weight of history, and I've been helped by reading Count Banfi, author of the Transylvanian trilogy, sometimes known as The Writing on the Wall. Banfi chronicled the last years of Habsburg rule before the First World War, the glittering balls, the country estates, the parliamentary intrigue, all that good stuff. Yet the true subject of the trilogy, as the introduction to the first volume makes clear, is much darker, and I'll put it up for you. It says, "The folly and insularity of those who danced and quarrelled their way to their self-destruction in the years leading up to the Great War, and the insularity of the politicians who were so preoccupied that they saw nothing of the storm clouds gathering over Europe." Now, given events on the continent and the tumult of recent days, it's difficult to read Banfi without a shiver, and not just because it's minus 10 degrees here. Throughout part one, he patiently constructs an atmosphere of civility and ceremony, but also inertia and denial. Even the title of the first volume, They Were Counted, hints at a reckoning that approaches inexorably, while the characters behave as though history will never present the bill. My favourite travel writer, Patrick Leigh Fermor, who walked across Hungary in the early 1930s and immortalised that journey in Between the Woods and the Water, described visiting many Hungarian aristocratic families who'd lost their lands after the First World War. Many sentences ended in a sigh, he recalled later. Those sighs persist to this day. It's striking how many conversations I've had here, including with the most senior figures in the Orbán government, that circle back to the traumas of the 20th century and use them to justify a refusal to support Ukraine. European leaders are dismissed regularly as warmongers. History, for many, is read as a cautionary tale against grand commitments. Choosing great causes, they argue, led Hungary to catastrophe twice over: defeat, occupation, and humiliation. Better then to be pragmatic. Morality, in this telling, is a dangerous luxury. Would Banfi agree? I can't say, I'm only halfway through the first volume, but I think not, somehow. But it's hard to find time for reading when among the scions, literal and metaphorical, of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Anyway, that's enough from me in snowy Budapest. See you all on Monday.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Francis and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons, to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.